Thank you for being patient, doctor. And you can proceed.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Colt Keo-Meier, and I oppose SB6. I'm a Texas licensed clinical psychologist practicing in Houston and Galveston, and I graduated summa cum laude from Rice University and attended University of Houston for master's and PhD for graduate school, and now I'm in medical school at the UTMB in Galveston. My area of expertise is transgender healthcare. I am a past board member of WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. This is the association that creates the standard of care for treatment of transgender patients. And it's been around since the 1970s, so it's not a new organization by any means. I am currently on the committee that's writing the 8th version of the standard of care for transgender patients across the world. In Texas, I co-founded our organization Gender Infinity, which puts on the state's largest annual transgender health conference. It's in October at University of Houston, and I hope the senators will join us there. Also, from a personal perspective, I am a devout Christian. It is my firm conviction that God created me to serve and care for God's transgender children of all ages. My daily work is to keep these people alive and safe, and that is my sacred duty, which I take very seriously. From a developmental perspective, a person's sex is not just about their external genitalia, although that's what we use when we determine what is the sex of the baby, a very frequently common question asked. As we know, it's composed of chromosomes, which most people don't even know their sex chromosomes. Most people haven't had that blood test done. Hormone levels post-puberty, internal genitalia, as well as external genitalia. One's gender identity is in their brain. It is their sense of self as a boy, as a girl, as both, as neither of those two options. And for most people, their sex assigned at birth matches their gender identity, except for transgender people, whose gender identity does not match what everyone else says their sex was. Every person has a gender identity, not just transgender people. I think that's really important to talk about, because when we hear gender identity, you think transgender. But all of us have a concept of ourselves as man, woman, or something different than those two. We've known about gender identity in the literature since the 1970s, over 40 years of psychological literature. This is not a new phenomenon from a research or science perspective. It is a new phenomenon for folks who are hearing it for the first time, because when you hear something for the first time, you say, oh, that's new. But just because it's new to you doesn't mean it's a new concept historically. Research has shown that gender identity develops in all people between the ages of 2 and 4. If you ask a 3-year-old, are you a boy or a girl, unless that child is severely developmentally delayed, they should be right on track to be able to answer that question, whether they're transgender or not. Also, research has found a biological basis of gender identity in brain connectivity, which I'm happy to answer more questions about. In terms of the current state of transgender healthcare, we are in an absolute crisis. Transgender women of color are harassed, beaten, and killed just for existing in our state as well as across the world. According to research, trans people have the highest rate of suicide attempts than any population by far. I was skeptical initially of data that showed 40% suicide attempt rates from a psychology perspective, because I'm used to seeing less than 10%, and so 40% to me was just this outrageous number. However, the data has come in, and that's been replicated and replicated and replicated. No matter how we run the numbers, 40% of trans people have a history of suicide attempt. Research has also found causal links between the amount of acceptance you are given from your family and friends and your long-term well-being and health care, according to, for transgender people. For example, a transgender person who is rejected by their family, who is not affirmed as who they know their gender to be, they're told that they're confused, that they're sick, that they're depraved, that they're beyond salvation, that they're unsafe around children. These folks are far more likely to attempt suicide than someone whose family and friends have embraced them and said, you know who you are, and we know who you are, and we love you. Two of the largest predictors of suicide in this population, now that we have research on it, are non-affirmation. That's the you don't know who you are, you're confused, which we've heard unfortunately over and over in initial testimony here. And I want to make a point that a lot of transgender people here are hearing that testimony, which is predictive of suicide attempts. The other variable that's a predictor of suicide in our population is feeling like you don't belong. In terms of treatment for transgender people, the international standards of care are well established since the 70s. They direct us as providers to provide affirmative care, and we affirm the patient's gender identity. This practice has been found to save lives. We see sharp reductions in suicidality, and I have witnessed miracles as these patients are given a new hope and a new life that they can walk in their truth of who they were created to be. These social gender transitions of living their new life in all environments are medically necessary interventions. And part of a social transition is being able to use facilities and restrooms in accordance with your gender identity, just like everyone else does. This particular bill makes it impossible for my patients to follow doctor's orders, as they would not be allowed to use restrooms since most of their birth certificates, over 70% of their birth certificates, list them as a different sex. Most transgender Texans, as you know, avoid using public restrooms because they're afraid of being confronted and harassed. Over a third of transgender Texans in the past year limited the amount they ate or drank to avoid using the restroom. This leads to increases in dehydration, kidney damage, and constipation. Psychologically, this bill is the definition of non-affirming. It communicates to transgender people that they do not belong. These are the two largest predictors of suicide, and quite literally, this bill is killing my patients. Schools, hospitals, and several cities across the U.S. have created policies that keep everyone safe in restrooms, including transgender people. There has never been one issue with a transgender person being reported to harm or attempt to harm another person in the restroom across the world. Transgender people are more likely to be assaulted in restrooms than for just being themselves. If you're truly concerned about the safety of women in restrooms, which I personally am as well, you realize that this bill does nothing more to protect them than the current Texas Penal Code already has, laws which make it illegal for anyone to enter a restroom with the intention of harming another person, regardless of the genders of anyone involved. Some people say that this bill has nothing to do with transgender people, that they can just get their birth certificate changed. This is nearly impossible. It costs over $300, and in nearly every county in Texas, judges routinely deny my patients from getting their their gender markers changed, even if they have a letter from me or any other provider. Less than 10% of transgender people have all their identity documents updated in the state of Texas. And lastly, from a personal perspective, transgender-based discrimination affects me personally, as I am a transgender man who made my gender transition over 10 years ago. When I came out to my Taekwondo instructors, where I was a volunteer for 20 years, of a volunteer teacher with children, I'm a child psychologist, I love kids, they told me I was no longer welcome on the mat with children. If you pass this bill, my gender and identity will further be invalidated, as I will not be able to continue attending medical school in the state of Texas. And I've worked very hard to get into medical school. Why, you ask? Why is that true? I would be banned from using the restrooms on campus. I would not be able to enter the men's rooms legally, and look at me. I would not be able to enter the women's restroom safely. And I really care about all those women who came up earlier and told us about the violence that they experienced. Do you want me to go in there and trigger those people? I don't think any of us want that. And so if you're saying I can't get into the men's room and telling me I can go into the women's room, that's the violence that we're all trying to prevent. Even though I'm not a violent person, still that triggering from looking at my appearance as the man that I am can be triggering for people.
I need to wrap it up. Senator Garcia, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Absolutely.
Thank you, first of all, for your patience and for sharing your story. And I think the question I want to ask goes to some of the previous testimony. I know the superintendent said that identity was fluid. I think the pastor said that he's known former lesbians and former homosexuals. And tell us about this. I mean, you say that the child starts identifying with a gender between 2 and 4. Is it really that fluid? Is there that much change? Can someone really decide today, although they've been a woman all their life, well, I'm going to go ahead and be a man tomorrow and go into the men's room, although we're not really concerned with men's bathrooms here, it's really women's. But could I really do that today, just to say, well, I'm going to be a man beginning tomorrow, everybody can start calling me Sylvester?
I'm really glad that you asked that question, because that's one of the most common misconceptions that we have. I want to talk specifically about children in schools first to answer that question, because of the concern of if you have gender identity open, then anyone, it's a free-for-all, boys can go in girls' restrooms. That is not how it works with any transgender person. That is not how it works. So what happens is the family will either come see me or a provider like myself. We'll do a full psychological evaluation. We will kind of document the consistency, insistency, and persistency of that person's gender identity to make sure it wasn't just
Could you repeat that?
the insistency, persistency, and consistency of that person's gender identity. So that we
One
will
more time.
insistent, consistent, and persistent.
Thank you.
In order to prevent any, one day I just, I went into the women's restroom because that was my new gender. We make sure that this is something that the person it is a unique core piece of their identity. And this, of course, can happen between as young as 2 and 4, right? Because that's the normative developmental period. So from there, we encourage the parents to work specifically with the school on an individual basis. And typically, in the Houston area, we've had great success with individual principals being able to work out a plan that keeps everyone in the school safe and allows that person to make their gender transition, which is part of their medically necessary treatment. I think the other piece that people don't understand is they give me the, well, what if they change their mind a lot? And we need to be able to make space for this child to explore, to then have their gender identity solidify. But if we just shut them down and we say, you can't do this, we don't understand you, you don't know who you are, their development is delayed in terms of gender identity. That further delays a lot of other very important developmental processes. Think about this. In order to socialize in school, having a gender identity as male or female is incredibly important, especially as we go through puberty. So if we're delaying a lot of these children from being able to develop that gender identity that everyone else gets to develop, right, we're going to have a lot of social delays, we're going to have a lot of that suicidality, we're going to have a lot of those issues that we talked about before. So in terms of gender fluidity, very few people identify as gender fluid. The folks that identify as gender fluid are a really wonderful part of our transgender community, but they are not the folks that folks are worried about, like somebody just one day will decide that they're a different gender. Again, because gender is such a core part of somebody's identity, we see a lot of people coming out later in life, like Caitlyn Jenner came out, right, 60 years old. So people are like, how in the world did this 60-year-old, if you said it forms in 2 to 4, how does a 60-year-old just one day figure this out? Well, if you listen to any of the interviews, what does she say? I've always known. I tried to suppress. I tried to suppress. I tried to suppress. And then one day I couldn't, take the pressure of hiding so tight anymore. And so if you see somebody who's coming out later in life, from a person who's not transgender, you might think, oh, that person just figured that out one day. But unfortunately, that's not the internal journey, and that's not the story of my people.
Right. Let me, the number you quoted for suicides, 40%. Can you give us an idea of what age group, or is it more often in younger children, in high school children, adults?
The majority of the surveys looked at adults, but the teenage studies also found that same percentage. The challenge is that that's actually an underestimate of the number of suicide attempts because, unfortunately, many people have completed suicide. And so they're not counted in the number when we interview people later in their life. They're not there anymore, they're not with us, so they're not included in that number.
Right. What other sort of emotional, psychological scars, if you will, could a child exhibit if, growing up, that is going through this transitioning? If we as society don't do the right thing about preparing a safe place for them, safe environment.
Absolutely. We are getting some wonderful research now on social transition in young children, because that was the big question of young children. We have data on adults, what about young children? And we are seeing some amazing results. If you look out of Christina Olson's, the literature in her study right now, she's doing a big longitudinal study, but she is comparing transgender youth to their siblings, and what she's found is these ones who are socially transitioning, their mental health is looking just as good as their siblings. And so what we see is that we have to look at it, we have to ask adults, we have to hear them, we have to hear their stories. And the number one regret of transgender adults, because we're all worried about people changing their mind, right? We're worried about that. The number one regret of transgender adults is, I wish I would have done this sooner. I wish I could have just done one puberty and not 2. 1 is enough. Come on, we all went through puberty. 1 is enough. And so, because we listen to the voice of our elders, and we're working with our youth, and we're not closing one door as they go through another, we're opening all the gender possibilities so that they can develop in a healthy manner. And so far what we're doing is the research now on these young kids is showing that they are doing as well as their peers if they're allowed to socially gender transition.
And how long does it usually take? I mean, in a perfect world and with your guidance, how long does it take for a child to transition?
It's such an individual story. Most kids just want a haircut and the new clothes, and they want to be called the new name, and she instead of he. All completely reversible things, right? We can get haircuts, hair can grow back, or grow hair out, we can cut it off. So in terms of, for kids, we don't do any medical interventions. I heard somebody say we do medical experiments on children. Clearly the person doesn't do transgender health care. We do, on prepubertal children, we do no medical interventions whatsoever. It's all haircut, it's being called a different gender, it's being able to live your life as a girl or a boy, if that is your truth.
Is there any particular differences in the challenges that one would face, whether they're male or female?
You know, it's hard to say, because I think a lot of times we talk about how transgender women have the harder experiences, and in many cases that's absolutely true. They are slaughtered and killed at higher rates than trans men are, for sure. However, I don't want to underscore the pain that transgender people experience no matter what their gender is. So for example, an unfortunate story of a transgender man who's about my age. When he was a child, he was already acting like a boy, even though he's assigned female at birth, and his family said, you better act like a girl. No daughter of mine is going to keep acting like a boy. And so unfortunately, his father raped him repeatedly and said, this is what a girl is. You will act like a girl. And so it's hard for me to compare, if you will, if the trans boys or the trans girls have a worse experience. It's so individual. What we know is the number one predictor, though, is that love and support of the family and accepting them and transitioning along with the child. That is what is the life-saving key here.
Right, when you said that this has been identified ever since the 1970s, did you mean that you started, you, the medical folks, first started seeing patients, or is it because that's when the science started, or is there a difference between what science says and what the medical experts say?
Absolutely, because we have history of trans people existing throughout all cultures throughout the beginning of written history. In 1970 was when doctors and social workers and healthcare providers who had been seeing transgender patients in their silos were finally brave enough to come out to each other, because there was a lot of risk involved in sharing with another provider in your field that you even took care of transgender patients. Right now I have a plastic surgeon that I work with who won't tell his plastic surgeon group that he does surgeries on transgender people because of the stigma associated with being transgender. So even the people who help us are afraid to connect. But in the 70s was when that first group was like, we have got to talk to each other. We don't know what we're doing. No one got education on this. And so in the 70s, that's when we saw a huge boom of research, of education in the fields, as well as providers connecting from all different countries throughout the world. And so in terms of the existence of trans people and us surviving and making it through, that's always been. But getting providers finally educated and finally together and making a standard of care, that began in the 70s.
Just one final question. So if you had your way to draft a bill today rather than this one, because you're here against this one, what would you propose we do to actually be more supportive in helping the schools in providing a safe environment for all our transgender kids and the kids around them? Because it's my view that this doesn't just impact the child that's transgender, but also their friends, because children feel each other's pain. So,
Absolutely.
I mean, what would you want us to do to be more helpful?
With the bill, I think in order to build trust with these minority communities and with our government, we need to start working together from the beginning of when these bills are crafted. Because right now, it's hard for me to trust folks on this board because no one came to talk to any of the experts who work with transgender providers and put us and our voice as part of this.
But I'm giving you a chance to write the bill. What would you have us do?
Absolutely. So this, in order to protect women and children, the conversation about transgender people is included because we are women and children, many of us, not me, but many transgender folks. However, putting this birth certificate stuff on there just seems like this really strange way of kind of catching us and putting us in the middle of this. And transgender people are not a threat to anyone else as a people. And so there's really no reason on this sort of a bill to protect women and children from folks who are coming to get them in the bathrooms. There's really no reason to have it directly impact this population that's already trying so hard to survive.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Rodriguez.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Doctor, just a few questions. And I think Senator Garcia kind of touched on what the principal issue I wanted to raise, which you've heard me raise in the morning with some of the other witnesses, because the mantra, if you will, the fear out there, as it is being articulated as the need for this bill, is that we can't have men going into women's bathrooms.
Absolutely.
And you heard me earlier say, if it's a transgender woman going male to female, transgender, going into a women's bathroom, that is not a man going into the bathroom.
Let it be
That is a female. Am I correct in that?
Let it be very clear that transgender women are women. That's it. Transgender women are women no matter what they look like. Women can look like anything, right? Whether they're trans or not.
Or irrespective of their genitalia.
Absolutely. You know, I used the women's restroom for 23 years, and I used the men's restroom for 10 years. I have not once seen any genitalia in any restrooms. That I don't know where people are seeing this, but I have not. I've been going to this men's room, and there apparently are a lot of male genitalia in there. I've never seen it. So this idea that, you know, this just because a trans woman may have a penis, right, that somehow she is dangerous or that's going to be seen is preposterous. Most trans women do not want to have a penis, and they will do anything they can to make sure no one will ever see it, especially in areas of public accommodation, especially in areas where people change.
So how do you go about dispelling that fear? I mean, I think you start out by saying that, you know, till recently, very little is known. I mean, you've done research and it goes back 40 years, but for all of those witnesses that we heard this morning that have this fear that their children are going to be exposed to predators, to people, you know, naked and so forth, how? I mean, it's a genuine fear and a feeling, authentic feeling that people have.
Absolutely.
And so in your studies and in the way you look at this, how do you suggest that we would address that particular feeling on the part of folks who really don't know transgender people?
And really that's the first thing with treatment of any anxiety condition. It's exposure to what you're afraid of. So when people are so anxious, they're terrified of something, we work with folks to expose them to what they're afraid of, to let them realize that, oh, that wasn't as scary as I thought it was. I had all these misconceptions, and now, okay, I figured it out. I think something that's incredibly important is that, I don't know where people got this idea that if we pass certain bills, not this one, but that are inclusive of gender identity, that then somehow the doors of women's restroom are just wide open for men. I really don't know where that idea came from. Because men are not women, so their gender identity is not woman, so they would not be legally allowed in women's restrooms. So it's a strange idea. The other piece is they're like, oh, well, this is going to make predators way more likely to just hop into women's restrooms because they have full access. If somebody tried that and then said, oh, and went in and harmed a woman, which is terrible, and then said, oh, it's because I'm transgender, being transgender is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It makes it much harder in this world to be transgender. So if that person went in, harmed somebody in the restroom, and said, oh, I'm transgender, they've still done something illegal. They went in and they harmed someone.
Well, right, and that's what I was trying to get at earlier, that, you know, people will do bad things regardless if they've got a mind to do it. If somebody, to follow what you just said, if somebody went into a bathroom that's some man and in fact, tried to pass off as a woman and did some harm. I mean, is that from a clinical or evidentiary standpoint, is that something that's easy to determine that this person is not genuinely transgender?
Absolutely.
In what way? How do you show that?
So that's why you have to call in us, folks who work with transgender people on a daily basis. You have to consult with experts on these sorts of issues if anything like that came up. So it wouldn't just be this people who've never seen transgender people or interacted with them trying to figure out, oh, are they really transgender or not? And if this person went in and did harm, they get arrested. They did something illegal. You can figure out the transgender or not part later, right?
Two other questions. Well, I think I heard you say earlier in your testimony that as a result of Senate Bill 6, if it were to pass, some of your patients couldn't follow doctor's orders. What did you mean by that?
Absolutely. So one of the first parts of treatment of the standards of care worldwide of transgender patients is having them undergo a social gender transition where they live in their true gender self. This helps us to know if that feels right for them. If they can't do that, then we're not sure if hormone therapy and the irreversible options are right for them. We have to be able to allow them socially transition to live in that new gender so that their brain can then develop around that and those new interactions to make sure that further consolidates their gender identity. So we absolutely have to have them in all areas, in all environments, be able to socially transition. Because what happens is, if you say, okay, well you can live as a woman, but you can't use women's restrooms, what happens is, from just a practical perspective, how are they supposed to just, rearrange their life? They have to go change to then use the men's restroom and then go change back into their women's clothes to live their life? Or they just don't use the restroom? So it's really a huge breakdown. I write letters for my patients that say, this is my client, they are transgender, so if anyone ever comes up to them, they'll have some information. However, a lot of times people aren't honoring even of my letters of care for my patients. And so this bill directly interferes with me providing medically necessary international standards of care practice. And I would love to work with you to make sure that it doesn't.
Okay, Senator Zaffirini, you're recognized.
I have one last question, Madam Chair.
One more.
Yes.
Okay.
I had two questions, so this is my last one.
Okay.
You heard, you were here in the morning, the word pervert or perversion bandied about by some of the witnesses, and in fact some of my colleagues. Now, as a doctor, you earlier said something about the harm that is visited on transgender community members. When people say, well, it's a perversion, you perverted, we're saying it here in front of transgender individuals, what does that do?
As a person of God, I have to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. To tell someone that they are a pervert for telling you the truth about their life, who's the perverted one in that case? So there's so many names that are thrown, there's so many stigma and stereotypes that are thrown out for a person who's just like, I've been dealing with this and I just wanted you to know. And in that moment, people have this wonderful opportunity to say, you do know who you are and you're still the same person, you're still safe. But this idea that just because we're different, somehow we're unsafe around children, that argument was used, do you remember when it used to be illegal for gay men to work in schools? What was the big argument against that? You're going to somehow corrupt the children or be unsafe around children. That does incredible damage to one's psyche, especially if your family, the people who know you the most and love you the most, tell you that you are going to hell. Anytime you try to go to your place of worship, and that's the message you get when everyone else gets to kind of be full and refreshed, your message is you're damned. Do you know why these people are killing themselves?
Thank you, Doctor.
Senator Zaffirini, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam
Yes,
Chair.
ma'am.
Doctor, there are many people who support this bill who believe that gender identity is a choice. How do you respond to those people?
I think for people who aren't transgender, the only way they can kind of think about it is if it was a choice, because for them, it would be a choice, because they're not transgender. And so if you're trying to think about it and understand it, for you to, let's say you, Senator, to be a man, that would be a choice you would make because your gender identity isn't man, so that it's easier for you to be like, okay, that would be a choice that I would make because it's not your truth. To the core of my being, the one thing I know most about myself is that I am not a girl. Period. Just as much as many other men sitting in here know that they are not a girl, same exact with me. So gender identity is not this fluff concept. There's wonderful research on it now these days. We have great research coming out of internationally. Spain, we looked at the gray and white matter patterns of the distribution of how the brain talks to each other, and there are male and female differences there. What they did was they took, so cisgender is the word for not transgender. So they took cisgender men, so not transgender men.
What is that word?
Cisgender, C-I-S-G-E-N-D-E-R. That means non-transgender. So most people in this room, well, I don't know, a lot of people in this room are cisgender. I don't know, right? We can't tell. That's right. So cisgender folks are not transgender. Sorry, I was distracted by a comment in the audience. Can you repeat the question?
And if you have more questions, Senator Zach?
Yes, I do.
Okay. You
Understand.
may need to restate it. I don't know if you...
No, I'll move to my next question. My next question is, are there some generalizations in the literature that we as legislature should know, as legislators should know, as we proceed with this bill?
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Right, but let me just speak. The audience, there's no outbursts, no discussion at all in the audience, please, okay?
Thank you.
We have to be able to hear the witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want me to
And
repeat
there's no
the question?
filming
Got it.
unless you're a certified media. Thank
I
you.
got it. So
Credentialed media.
the brain research is something very important. So since the early 90s, we've had brain research on trans folks, and we're getting more and more of it as the brain technology is better, so we can actually scan people's brains when they're alive. Because the problem is, old brain research, people had to be post-mortem, so they had to be dead, and then we would examine their brains from there. Now we can examine transgender people's brains before they start hormone therapy, as well as after. And so what is common finding these days is that white and gray matter patterns of transgender people's brains match their gender identity and not their sex. What does that mean? That means that a transgender man like me, according to the research, is likely to have a brain matter pattern distribution that is similar to cisgender men and not to females, even though my sex assigned at birth was female.
Thank you. Assuming that this bill will pass, are there any amendments that you have that would at least improve it?
Take out anything about our birth certificates, because it costs over $300. Most people are not able to afford changing their birth certificate. Most judges will say no to it. It is an impossible task for a trans person, except for maybe the top 10% that have a lot of money to afford a lawyer who knows exactly where to go to get that done. And even so, we have a backlog of over 6 months from getting your paperwork back from the birth certificate and vital statistics. What we really need to do is we need to figure out how to protect transgender women. A wonderful senator over here with pearls said earlier that just one incidence of violence was enough for us to take steps to protect women and children. In 2015 and 2016, 6 transgender women of color were killed in Dallas, Tyler, El Paso, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin. Monica, Veronica, Shantae, Erica, Ty, and Sharday. Where is the outrage for them? That's more than one act of violence. So I would say we need, if we're working with transgender people, if we're putting them in this, we need something separate that protects them from violence, especially our transgender sisters of color.
Are there some generalizations related to respectful language when we're dealing with transgender?
Absolutely. I've heard some interesting language here. So transgender is the current academic term, talking about folks whose sex differs from their gender identity. So transgenders is a word that is used colloquially, especially among the elders in our population, but in terms of an academic and a legal perspective, the word transgender, without an ED, without an S at the end, is most appropriate in terms of our times. Also LGBTQ together for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. The other letters are about sexual orientation, and the T is about gender identity. And if you put the I in there for intersex, a lot of people talk about, and we heard some testimony that there's just male and female and that's it. But in terms of biological sex, intersex folks have a combination of sex characteristics that are different from only male or only female. The old term for that was hermaphrodite, and it is absolutely offensive to continue using the word hermaphrodite. So intersex is the appropriate term there, because they are also impacted by this bill because their sex may have been ambiguous at birth. but they were assigned a sex just because they had to figure something out, and so they may have some issues with this bill in addition to transgender people.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Lucio, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being with us here today. Just for my information, what is the transgender people population in Texas?
In Texas, about 125,000 of us. We have depending, there's two studies right now. We have either the second or third largest transgender population in the United States.
And have you identified children who would like to see themselves trans or change their gender as well?
Absolutely. I was a child once myself,
Is that
too.
part of the 125,000 you're talking about?
Yes, but it's an underestimate, because in order to get them to fill out the surveys, and depending on the parents that they have, the parents might not be supportive, so they might say, oh, my kids, this is just a phase, this is not really what's going on.
So those are estimate numbers, correct?
Absolutely, and they are gross underestimates.
Well, I feel as you do, and others, that we need to address their needs and concerns. They should be addressed, but I ask you, how do you feel about the non-transgender people of our state? Should they have their privacy rights addressed as well?
I have a question about that. How does my existence violate anyone's privacy? I'm still trying to figure this out. How does our existence using restrooms, how does that violate anyone's privacy? Really, our privacy is also at risk. And whenever people put two groups together, and women and children is one of those groups.
I understand what you said. I've been listening attentively to what you're saying, even though I came in late. I know exactly how you feel. I'm asking you, do you think they have the right to have their privacy rights addressed as well in this
Everyone's privacy rights need to be addressed. It is important for everyone to use the restroom safely, and targeting the transgender population and disallowing us from having the equal rights of using restrooms like everyone else by their gender identity is not the answer.
One last thing, I appreciate you referring to the Bible, I really do, so I take it you believe in God.
Absolutely, and I truly believe that when...
So you believe in God and you believe in His creation.
Absolutely.
Do you also believe in altering His creation, changing His creation?
I believe that God can make all things new and that nothing is impossible with God. I believe that God can make me to help people to make gender transitions, to live. I believe that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. And as I was trying to figure out if I was going to do this whole gender thing, and there was not everybody supportive in my life, I kept coming back to Jesus is the truth. And I know the truth of me is not girl. The truth of me is male. And in order to be closer to Jesus and closer to the truth, I had to live and express that. And because of that, do you know how many more kids are alive?
Well, we obviously have a difference of opinion in terms of how we feel about God's creation. You know, God created everything as far as I'm concerned, but especially man and woman. And I certainly do not want to discriminate against anyone. As a matter of fact, I've made it very clear this morning in my open remarks that I want to make sure that this bill, carries with it a legislative intent of addressing the needs, especially a fundamental need is a bathroom. Absolutely. But we also need to take into consideration at the very same time what the public of this state is asking us to do, and that is to address the privacy rights of all citizens of this state and not just focus on one particular, group of people.
Yes, sir, and one's privacy does not come at the expense of another. I think setting us up as
I don't think that's the case here.
That's unfortunately what most of our
I don't think that's the case. I think that we obviously have to step up to the plate, and we're going to pass public policy in this state. We should also make sure that whatever we do comes the support and need and funding necessary to help those that are going to be impacted. But I think, quite frankly, that we could eliminate a lot of problems by making sure there are facilities for those that want to be categorizing, for lack of a better word, as
Senator-
transgender people.
Senator, I think you're talking about segregating us. I think
No,
you're talking
no,
about making
no, not at all.
facilities.
Not at all. They'll feel better, and other people will feel better. We've had testimony here this morning. I'm against segregation, okay?
So today we
I
have-
lived through the civil rights, era, which you did not, okay? And I know what it is to be discriminated against, and I wouldn't want anyone to go through that. This is nowhere close to that. We want to address the needs of transgender people of this state, and we have to make the adjustments necessary to make sure that no one in any way is hurt along the way. Transgender people and non-transgender people of this state.
And
So we have to be inclusive, okay?
That's right, because creating a separate place for transgender people to go would be treating us differently because we're transgender, and that would be segregation. So that's what
I
want to
embrace all
make sure.
human beings. Thank you very
Absolutely.
much. Thank you.
You do.
Senator Creighton.
Yes, Doctor, just a couple of questions. Can you again, just for clarity, explain how many genders are there, in your opinion?
Absolutely. So I think it's important that we talk about sex as well as gender, right? So sex, people talk about there's male and female, but as you know, with intersex people, there are over 400 different intersex conditions where people aren't 100% male or 100% female. There's over 70 different chromosome conditions where someone, instead of having XX or XY, can have X and nothing. That's called Turner syndrome. XXY, Klinefelter syndrome. So in terms of biological sex, there are way more than 2 biological sexes. So we have to start there. Then we can move to gender identity. Gender identity, of course, people identify as male and female, and then there's also some people feel like neither of those 2 options works for who they know themselves to be. So
can you give me a number?
absolutely not. Every person has their own unique identity, right? So in terms of what we know, is 1/3 of trans people identify as men, 1/3 of trans people identify as women, and 1/3 of people identify as non-binary trans identities.
So you listed several different gender identities prior. I think you were at 3 or 4. I was just asking for you to help me clarify.
There's not a number. The human experience is so diverse. The idea that I could put a number on how many genders there are or sexes there are is impossible. You have to meet people, you have to look at the history, you have to look at literature. Just because people in your families and the communities you live in fit into 2 groups doesn't mean that is the whole of existence.
Is there a top 5 by percentage?
What I said, transgender men are 1/3 of our population, transgender women are 1/3, and non-binary means 2 options. So non-binary doesn't fit into 2 options.
I think you mentioned cisgender in that
So
category
cisgender
as
would
well.
be not transgender. So that's a great question. I really want to clarify this because I think you're asking really important questions that people need to understand for this. So when I say 1/3 of us are transgender men, the gender identity is man. And so cisgender can be men too, right? So man. So I assume you're a cisgender man, and I'm a transgender man.
That is correct.
So we have the same gender identity. One gender identity is here that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Okay? Women, so there are cisgender women, there are transgender women, so that's gender identity number 2. And then non-binary folks. So cisgender folks generally don't identify as non-binary. They identify as men or women. So non-binary is one beautiful category of trans people, and they're about 1/3 of us.
Have you counseled or treated a patient that was in transition?
Oh, absolutely. All of my patients are transgender.
And then have you counseled or treated a patient in transition that later, because of that comfort zone that you mentioned, it just ultimately wasn't reached, and they, for just certain personal reasons, transitioned back?
So in my practice, I have not had a patient transition again to a different gender than the first one we helped them transition to.
But your expertise is broad, and you're well-studied.
Absolutely.
And certainly very well-known and accomplished in these conversations. So are you aware of that situation?
That is brought up a whole lot, but unfortunately, it's, in terms of if a person transitions one way and is like very frustrated with that, or it doesn't work out, or people fired them for their job, or and they were like, okay, this one is not working for me.
For whatever the reason, has there been a transition back?
Which I said, yes, is a very, very rare occurrence, but it's not a transition back. What it is people's genders are journeys. We're not going forward and back, we're going forward.
And there is an origin to each journey, and
Absolutely.
path.
So, and if somebody makes a gender transition, is going feminine, and says, you know what, this isn't right for me, then the gender-affirming treatment is say, okay, well, what is right for you? And we will follow you and we will help you in that way.
do you support, is it your testimony that you support in a multi-stall restroom situation, let's say in a city hall building? Do you support the removal of signage for those restrooms that identifies those multi-stall restrooms by gender?
For the purpose of working with SB6 and multi-stall restrooms and where we are in the state of Texas right now, and my testimony for this particular bill, I am not in any way asking people to remove signage from bathrooms. I think having options for folks to use restrooms safely is very important, and there are sometimes non-binary folks who don't fit into men or women categories. They need to be able to use either of those restrooms safely, just like everyone else.
So just for clarification, it's not your testimony that you support the signage being removed that identifies those multi-stall restrooms by gender?
Not for the purposes of SB6 and why we're here talking about it today.
Not for the purposes of the bill. So it's hard to answer that for you as a yes or a no. It's just, your answer is just not for the purposes of the bill.
I'm here to talk about the bill, and this bill and what we're trying to do right now is not to remove all these signs in every place in Texas.
So you'd rather not comment on your position of whether or not you would support in a multi-stall bathroom in a city hall building, a restroom sign being removed if it is a sign that is identified by gender. You would rather just not comment on that?
If the individual, City Hall, and the transgender community there work together to make that happen and safe for everyone in that city, I think that would be wonderful if that could happen.
And then how can we, because all of us here have the utmost respect for every single individual human being. All of us here. We do. So my next question is, how do we prevent bad actors from infringing upon the rights of those that do not identify as transgender persons, under the pretext of saying that they internally, without any way, shape, or form to substantiate it by another person, they internally, at that moment, identify as a gender other than their biological gender?
People don't just say they're transgender on a lark, or to go in and to harm people.
People will say anything if their intentions are bad.
And this bill does nothing to change people's intentions whatsoever. So in terms of how do we prevent people from harming, I think our legal organizations have been working on preventing crime and how do we prevent harm for many, many years, and things still happen. But this is not about, if we allow trans women to use women's restrooms, then somehow this parade of crimes will happen. This is just a strange idea, and unfortunately, what it does is it leads to, again, the death of my people. And so when you're telling me you have respect for human life, when I'm telling you the problems with these bills and how they lead to the death of my people, and when you keep questioning me about predators, which is not part of the transgender community, it's hard for me to feel like you respect
It's not about a parade of crimes. It's about specific examples of crimes that have been mentioned in this hearing that no one has refuted or said that they didn't happen or that it was bad information or bad reporting. And that word perversion was not used about transgender persons earlier by another member that's not here now. That word was used to describe a bad actor that would be using the identity as a transgender person as a pretext for coming into a multi-stall restroom, shower, or locker room to harm another person, just as those examples reported are true.
Excluding transgender women from using restrooms has nothing to do with this idea that these people are going to pretend to be transgender. Because right now, in different states, some transgender women and men are able to use restrooms according to their gender identity with no problem, and some have a bill or something that's on the way. But of that, any place right now, with the bill or not, this could happen, just like you're saying. People could go in right now. These doors don't have locks on them, right? And so just this idea that we keep hammering, we keep coming back to this idea that somehow this bill, this is the step to prevent this happening, these doors are all still open no matter what we have on paper.
Well, and these doors were open 2 years ago, but you were not here. You said earlier there hasn't been as much communication with you as needed, but you weren't here.
No one has reached out to me. I've been so busy working with these
And these doors were open
patients.
2 years ago, following a few months later when the HERO ordinance was turned
And I
down in
testified in
Houston
HERO.
for the very safety reasons that I mentioned. And
testified
on top
in
of that, the same question is still my question, which is if you're not comfortable stating your opinion on whether or not you would support a multi-stall restroom in a city hall, having restrooms with signage that is not identified by gender, then your position to not take a position in that situation or under that hypothetical, it still leads to the question that many of us have, which is how to protect the privacy of women and young girls for those that might identify with bad intentions in a way that really truly doesn't identify that person.
And again, you keep talking about this, but according to this bill and everything that we're working on and all the work with transgender patients, I really just want to help my transgender patients use restrooms, and they have privacy just as well as everyone else does. So I want to work with you. I want to figure out ways we can do that, but right now, what you're doing is systematically excluding my patients from a basic right of being able to relieve themselves in public spaces.
So how do you feel about the Charlotte ordinance?
Tell me more about it.
The ordinance where earlier we had the North Carolina Lieutenant Governor.
Was that HB2 or is that a separate city thing?
It was the city.
It was the city.
And the city said?
Well, I'm not an expert on it, but the city,
No, I did on occasion.
the city passed an ordinance that caused public outcry that basically stated that there was no identification for restrooms by gender.
That's not something that I'm familiar with. What I do know of the HB2 in North Carolina is that I would not be able to use the restroom in that state. And that's what I'm familiar with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate your questions.
Yes, all right. We'll move on to Jess Herbst.